The first organized states began to emerge on this planet with the agricultural revolution. So think the agricultural revolution began something like 10,000 years ago. And it probably went like this in most cases. There would be a river running through an area. And the people who were hunter-gatherers in that area, in other words, the people who hunted down wild animals and gathered wild growing food, noticed that along the banks of the river, there were naturally growing things that they could eat. And indeed, they gathered that stuff all of the time. And of course, those food products that they gathered that were wild growing products in the area along the riverbanks also attracted animals. So it was a win-win to be in that area. You could hunt in that area and you could gather the wild growing foods. Over time, as human beings began to figure out that they could take the seed itself instead of eating it and put it into the ground and grow their own food, or do cuttings from the plants and put that in the ground and grow their own food, and thereby guarantee food supplies in most cases, what began to happen is people began to construct permanent buildings, structures. Most people today believe that those first structures were actually built to store the surplus food. Because you can imagine, after millions of years of us wandering around, we were not simply going to give up our wandering nature so easily. We still wanted to move around, we still migrated. But over time, because we had a permanent supply of food that we could count on, we began to build these structures and then put the food inside of it, still move around a little bit, but we had a place where we stored our food that we could come back to. And over more time, what begins to happen is more structures get built as the surplus increases, as we understand agricultural technology better, and we begin to build houses that we are going to live in. And then as more time passes, of course, population begins to increase because there's less starvation. We have permanent supplies of food that we can count on. And so the structures get bigger. And as the structures get bigger, there begins to be more people. There begins to be a much more rigidly defined hierarchy that begins to happen, where some people have bigger structures, some people have smaller structures, some people have more access to food, some people have less access to food. And then these things show up. What do you think those are about? That's right. Well, this happens today too. This is a mixing of politics and religion, and a really strictly defined hierarchy evolves in the now evolved urban structure. And then what's next? We build a wall. That's right. Whether that's an earthen structure or a mud brick structure, we build this wall. Why do you think we build the wall? I'll wait. That's right, to keep other people out, because we don't want those other people getting our stuff. So you can see this goes back to the beginning of cities, that we were very protective of what we had. Once you build the wall, though, now typically what happens is the agricultural land moves outside of the wall into the hinterland, and farmers go out, work on the land, generally come back inside the city, and then they sell their products, or they barter their products, or they bargain for things. And that's what began to happen. And this is probably how the first cities on the planet evolved. And the first place this began to happen was in Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent. In other words, in the Middle East. You can see on the left-hand side Mesopotamia, which is literally means the land between the rivers, which is the area between the Euphrates and the Tigris. You can see Baghdad is there. It's in modern-day Iraq. Eventually, over time, that technology spread, and so that whole area there becomes part of what's known as the Fertile Crescent, because it's shaped like a crescent moon or a croissant, that piece of bread that the French eat and that we eat also. So you could see that it goes up through Mesopotamia from the Persian Gulf, up through southern Turkey, along the eastern banks of the Mediterranean, and then down through the Nile River Valley. So that area becomes the Fertile Crescent. This is the first place where this really begins to happen, that evolution of agriculture that then turns into an evolution of urban structures. A lot of these urban structures, at least at first, were what we call city-states. A city-state is this. It's a city that is also a sovereign country, and that includes the surrounding countryside. At first, it was things like the very famous Ur and Babylon and Hit and Kish and Mohenjo-Daro, Athens, Sparta, all of these things were early city-states. Do they still exist today? Well, yes, in a way, sort of. Generally, we refer to them less as city-states, a little bit of city-states, but mostly as microstates, which is what it sounds like. These are countries with very little land area. Usually they're centered on one city, and that one city acts as the capital. For example, the Vatican, which is the smallest of all, it sits right in the middle of Rome. It's the seat of the Catholic Church. Monaco, which is along the southern coast of France. Monaco is the smallest of these microstates that's actually in the United Nations. The Vatican is not a member of the United Nations. Singapore. Singapore sits right at the southern end of the Malay Peninsula on an island. San Marino, also in Italy, up kind of along the northeastern coast of Italy. Bahrain, which is in the Persian Gulf. Liechtenstein, which is between Switzerland and Austria. I mean, you're looking at almost all of Liechtenstein right there in that picture. Barbados, which is in the Caribbean. These are all microstates. Now, the early city-states came about as a result of the agricultural revolution, which brought about cities. It brought about urban centers because of what I just spoke about. Some of these early city-states eventually evolved into larger empires, but they started as city-states, like the Sumerian city-states, like the very famous Ur and Kish, both of which I already mentioned. In the Indus River Valley, in the Indus River Valley civilization, places like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, this is in modern-day Pakistan, along the Indus River. In Africa, the very famous Great Zimbabwe, or the Kingdom of Kush, which had close ties to the ancient Egyptians. In Mesoamerica, with the Maya, you had Tikal and Chichen Itza and Kobat and Tulum. Some of you have probably been to some of these places. Uxmal. Many of these early city-states eventually grew in power. Now, some of them just died off or were taken over by other people. But as some of these early city-states grew in power and influence, they became the world's first empires. Like the Sumerian state, the Sumerian Empire, with these kind of pyramidal structures that are called ziggurats. You can see on the right-hand side a depiction of it, and then the left-hand side, real one that's in Iraq. And you can see that Ur and Kish are both part of the Sumerian Empire, or were. That Babylonian Empire, which followed the Sumerian Empire. You can see on the left-hand side, do you know what that is? The Tower of Babel. There you go. You know, this is where we get the term babbling, right? Like sort of just speaking a bit of nonsense because of, you know, supposedly what happened with the Tower of Babel. I'll let you kind of work that out. Then on the right-hand side, we have the Code of Hammurabi. This Assyrian Empire, which then kind of gobbled up that entire area where the Fertile Crescent is at, and of course spread the technology, the food technology, the agricultural technology, and the cultural technology. And you can see Nineveh is right in the middle. On the right-hand side, you can see the very famous winged bull from Nimrod. The Persian Empire, that on the right-hand side is Persepolis, with this famous book, Persepolis, a graphic novel. And you can see where the Persian Empire was at. It spread all the way from Greece over to modern-day Pakistan. And this is what the Trojan Wars were about. The Roman Empire, everybody knows about that one. You can see on the right-hand side, you can see that's part of ancient Rome, the Roman Forum that remains. And you can see that the Romans controlled all of the Mediterranean. You can see it says Mare Internum in Latin, right? What is that sea today? What do we call that? The Mediterranean Sea. What does Mediterranean mean? Middle of the land, because it sits right in the middle of these land structures, Africa and Europe. The Aztec Empire, which is also Mexica or the Triple Alliance Empire, whatever you want to call it. And of course, the center of that was Tenochtitlan, which today is literally the center of Mexico City. The Mughal Empire, which brought us one of the most famous structures on earth, the Taj Mahal. And you can see that that's stretched across that area from Bangladesh all the way over to Iran and across northern India and Pakistan. Large swaths of land were not, however, part of imperial possessions. Large swaths, probably most of the planet. And borders were usually fuzzy. If they weren't a river or a lake or an ocean, the borders tended to be fuzzy. It wasn't exactly clear where you left the empire and entered something else. And because of that, empires generally had a kind of frontier. It's a zone that separates states or people, but is not officially controlled by a state. The state might want to control it, but it's a little bit sketchy in terms of who actually controls it and what laws, if there are any, are in place. Over time, more and more land, though, became claimed by states until, like we have today, basically the entire planet is claimed by somebody. So guess what happened to hunter and gatherer societies as the states grew and officially demarcated and defined their territories? That's right, they slowly began to fade out because they were forced into the general apparatus of the modern state.